Hello, I'm Shanti from Whipstone Farm. We are in northern Arizona. We just wanted to take you on a little greenhouse tour today, kind of show you our methods and what we do. We're at pretty high elevation, so we actually have a rather late last frost date of June 1st or end of May. So you'll kind of see the plants that we have and the stages that they're at are all geared towards our last frost date, and whether they're cold hardy or not. We can actually plant out fairly early in the spring cool season annuals and cold hardy plants, but our like heat loving frost tender plants go out quite a bit later unless they're going in a greenhouse. So we like into one of our other greenhouses in the ground, so things are staggered for all of those purposes. These are what we call the propagation greenhouse. It's the only greenhouse out of our like 10 greenhouses total that has heat, or I guess we have one other little overflow greenhouse that has like a little space heater, but this is where we do all of our seed starting. So the way that we heat in here is that we have a hot water heater, which is currently run off propane, but we're hoping to get that on solar at some point. Hot water goes from the hot water heater into these pipes that run into a manifold underneath our greenhouse benches. So this sheet metal is on here just to spread the heat out. Hot water is going through this PEX tubing. And then we can control the temperature from the hot water heater. When we originally bought this greenhouse, it came with this heater. And it still functions, but we just have decided it's pretty expensive to run that heater and keep this to the temperatures that we need. So we just heat from the bottom of the benches with hot water, and then at night in the winter and early spring, okay, it'd be hard to show you from here. Anyway, we use these like insulated blankets, and they go up and over the table. I just have to start from the other end to make it work. And then that keeps the heat within this little bubble of the table, rather than trying to heat the entire airspace and lose as much heat as we do. So that's just, it's a little bit more time consuming on a daily basis to cover and uncover every day, but that allows us to save a lot on cost when we are heating. So I just wanted to start with showing you, well, I'll just say that temperature is super important with plant growth. So keeping things at the temperature they want to be at, especially for the germination period, is what's going to give you like way more success in, you know, not only, so like the faster the seeds come up at their optimal temperature, the better overall success you're going to have. I feel like they're a little more flexible post germination. They might grow slower or faster based on the temperature, but like that germination period is really important. So in a little bit, I'll show you, we have a germination chamber where we can control that a little better. And then as plants grow on in here, we might adjust the temperatures for the different benches. So there'll be like a few that I have on full blast warm, some that are just like half open, so they're not staying quite as warm. And then the other thing is we always max out our space by a lot. So we've got, you know, our plants on the top. I like to put everything new on top, because if it doesn't get full sun, it starts to get leggy and it stretches, and it's really hard to reverse the stretching. You know, once they're leggy and like have a skinny stem, it's really hard to get it to grow to a point where it's real sturdy again. So I like to have them in like direct light to begin with, but after they get a little bit further along in their development, oftentimes we pop trays under the table. So here they're a little shadier, which may or may not be good temperature wise, and there's no bottom heat, but they're getting a little residual heat from these tables. So it's more of like a holding spot, maybe growing on a little more, but then I have to keep an eye to make sure they don't get too leggy. So like these are tomatoes, they're in pretty small cells right now, but they're doing fine. They're not too leggy, but they're also not going to grow that big because it's in a rather small. So, but anyway, we're just constantly shuffling plants to give everything what it wants, give everything like it's what it needs. So that's the heating part, but it's also really important to have cooling as well. So like this greenhouse has roll-up sides. You have to go on the outside and use a little crank. Both sides roll up. So as soon as it gets hot enough during the day, at least this time of year, late spring, we roll up the sides. There's a few automatic fans that come on at a certain temperature, like this fan on the, it's not a fan, this is a vent in the front and it has a louver. So so you can set the temperature you want it to open at. So that's what happens first. That vent opens. And then at a little higher temperature, this fan on the back wall comes on. So we're getting like cross ventilation this way. So those will happen automatically. Rolling up the sides is something we do manually. If we had a bigger, like more automated greenhouse, we might have everything be automated. But ours takes a lot of kind of hands-on maintenance. When we first installed this greenhouse, we did put in an automatic watering system. So that's these, I mean, we just built it ourselves, but that's these pipes along here to carry water. And they would come down here. These are little weighted things. And then it had like a micro sprayer on the bottom, or I think they're called micro sprinklers. I will say it just took a lot of maintenance. Like they would fill with algae. We would clean them out. There'd be areas that didn't water well that we would have to like spot water. And it just got to the point where it wasn't worth dealing with. Kind of how poorly the system worked. So we ripped it out, or we stopped, you know, I took the sprinklers off and we turned it off. I would like to figure out a new system and install something. We probably spend about 30 minutes to an hour a day just watering the greenhouse. This plus, you'll see we have some like other seedling areas. So yeah, it's probably this time of year when everything's full, probably an hour a day. Early on in the season where we just have a few things, or once most of the stuff has gone outside and it's minimized, it might only be like 10 to 15 minutes a day. But water's really important. I mean, you just have to keep a really keen eye on watering, because as soon as something dries out too much, you can usually get it to come back from a wilty stage, but you can't get it to come back from like a crispy stage. And the difference between like dry but not wilty and wilty and crispy is very slim. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, let's start out with our soil. So currently we use this for our soil mix. It's not like it's the best thing in the world, but I can buy this locally. I can get pallets of it at Home Depot. It's probably not the cheapest way to get it, but we just, where we live, there's not a ton of farms around here, and that we don't have access to like bulk potting soil that's of good quality. I would love to get something different. We are getting really good growth with this, so even though it's a little expensive, I think it's about like $20 for one of these bales. I've tried a lot of different potting soils, and I will say that like if something you're using doesn't get good plant growth, it's a complete waste of your time. So if you're just buying like something bagged from a hydroponic shop or a big box store or whatever, like try a few different ones and find the one that works for you. So this one is definitely like a seed starting mix. So it's very light and it has good texture. If I'm planting into smaller cells, I do actually have to sift it through with a homemade sifter that we made. But for the most part, I don't. It's a little bit sticky, but it's not, as in it has little sticks in it, but it's not too bad. So we use this potting soil, and I add some of this fertilizer when we plant. This is Espoma Biotone starter. So for one whole bale, I add 1 cup of fertilizer, because this doesn't have a lot of fertility in it. If you were doing a lot of bumping up from like a smaller cell to a bigger cell, you probably don't even need it in your initial planting, and you could add it later, but we don't bump everything up. And I don't like to have to do a lot of like fish emulsion or foliar feeding. Okay, so we have a couple different tray sizes that we use for the most part. And I've actually transitioned from like the flimsy trays to they're a lot more expensive, but these like really sturdy plastic trays. So this one is called PropTech. That's the company that makes it. And this is a 144. We used to start almost everything in a 128, but this 144 is about the same size. To get these directly from the company, you have to buy an entire pallet. But if you want to just buy a couple, they sell them at Greenhouse Megastore, which is where we actually buy a lot of our other pots and whatnot. Okay, this tray, this is new. We just got these less than a month ago. So this is a 72, and we've used a lot of 72s in the past. I'll show you what the kind of flimsy ones look like. These actually have a bigger cell for a 72. So the numbers that I'm stating, if it's not already obvious to you, is just like the number is how many cells you have in basically, these are all like 10, 20 size trays, 10 inches by 20 inches. So those are the old 72s we use. They're very flimsy and break easily, and getting the plugs out is not always the easiest thing. Some things pop up more easily than others. So these new ones that we have, called Wind Strip, I just like how sturdy they are. It's very rigid plastic. And then there's a lot of it, so you're not planting in these little in-between squares, just in these bigger ones. They have a very big opening at the bottom, which is supposed to help with air pruning the roots and not letting the roots circle around, which can be problematic for seedlings, because then when you take them out of here and put them in the ground, the roots still want to circle and they have a hard time like breaking out of that cycle. So these are new. I'm not totally convinced that they're worth all the hype, but I bought a couple hundred of them, so we'll see. And these come from Neversink Tools. So Neversink Farm, he has like a whole online course on mostly vegetable production, but Windstrip is Windstrip is the company that made them, I think, and then Neversink just sells them. So each square is a bit smaller, but then you have this airspace in between, and that's just supposed to help with that stuff. So we also have this 200 sized cell tray. So if something especially has a really tiny seed, or I don't think it has great germination, I know I want to plant it and then bump it up into something else, I might start with a 200 and bump it up to a 72. Now all of that timing of like going from a smaller cell to a bigger cell, it's very time consuming, and so I only do that where I feel like it warrants the process. Otherwise I just plant in the bigger cell, hope to get really, pretty even germination, and then plant directly to the field from there. And then this year we've been doing a lot of seedling sales. So like we use these, our 3.5 inch pots, and now that I've grown tomatoes in 3.5 inch pots, I'm like, oh, kind of want to do that for ourselves. It's been so nice having bigger plants to put in the ground or in the greenhouse. In the past, I guess I just was greedy, and I wanted to put everything in the smallest cell I could get away with, and then plant them outside. But it really, like, you don't really want a tomato in a 5-gallon pot that's like already 3 feet tall when you plant it outside, because it doesn't make the transition very well. But this is actually like a wonderful size to plant, and it gets you far ahead of the tomato I showed you in the 72 cell, which is only like that tall. So anyway, that's the soil, and that's our pots. We're still pretty like old school, and we like mix it in a wheelbarrow, or if we have to sift it, we sift it in the wheelbarrow, mix in the soil, mix in the fertilizer. And then I like this little board on top of my wheelbarrow just as like a flat hard surface to fill my trays on. So we'll just fill a whole stack of trays before we start planting. We do have some tools that help us automate some of the seeding, like a vacuum seeder and a drop seeder. On a small scale, it's definitely not worth it. Like if you're not planting more than 5 trays of one thing, it's not even worth like busting it out. But it can help when we're planting like, 20, 40, 50 trays of something to use the vacuum seeder, or rather the drop seeder. So like, for instance, these are pepper plants. We grow a lot of peppers, and all of these are planted in 200 cell trays, and then we're just bumping them up to 72 trays. It's probably only going to take them 2 to 3 weeks to grow on in these before they fill out that cell, but they're going to have a lot. It's going to be a much hardier, larger plant when we put it outside. I guess a few other trays that we're using is we do microgreens, and we put them in these paper pot kind of open. They're like an open tray with no cells in it. And then we use some paper pot trays for certain crops. Basically, if you can see this little honeycomb pattern, it's all connected. They also call them chain pots. So these are made out of paper in this honeycomb pattern, and they're connected on a chain like this. You spread it out with a little spreader bar into this tray, fill it with soil, but you have to have a special tool to actually plant it in the field. It's like a little transplanter tool that you pull along the field with you. So this is a very like specialized system. We just got it last year, and I'm still working out the kinks of deciding if we really truly like it. But for certain crops it works really well, especially crops that don't like their roots disturbed, or don't come out of their cells very easily, because you don't have to dislodge those out of their cell, it just unravels and plants into the ground. But you have to have really nice soil conditions to make that work. So as far as time management in the greenhouse, I'm not tracking it super well, but I have one person who's my greenhouse manager. Basically, I make her lists, like either weekly or daily, of what needs to be done in here. So I'll just show you. We have a little like communication journal over here. So sometimes it's just like to-do lists. This we're tracking how many trays of peppers we have, because we're going from the smaller size to the bigger size. I want to know how many of the bigger trays we have so that when we plant them out in the field, we're not missing any and we can put them all together. But in general, this is what our planting lists look like. I just generate them I have like a master spreadsheet of everything we plant. So here's all the peppers when we did the initial seeding of them. Sorry, it's probably hard to see on here. But it just lets whoever's working in here know exactly how many I want of everything, what size tray to use, how many trays, how many seeds per cell, because some things we multi-seed, like kohlrabi, for instance, we'll put 3 seeds in a cell and plant it out like that. And then, you know, some seeds we don't cover because they like to germinate. Other things we do. And then I'll just leave notes, like this is how to fertilize. I should probably have that typed out. But I have some SOPs, which is standard operating procedures on how we sow seeds. So, you know, you might do it by hand. When I'm doing it by hand, we use these little super cheapy hand seeders that have different size holes. I think they cost like $5. It does help you to like not have it sitting in your hand, but having it in this tray, and you kind of get used to like tipping it at the right angle to get the seeds out. Or if we're going to use the vacuum seeder or whatever, it's kind of like all laid out there. And then I have some other like info in here on like planting microgreens, or you know, just any info we might be using. And then just because it's hard to keep track of all the things that are going on, like I said, we just sometimes have lists of like, hey, like what should we be doing right now, like potting things up or thinning things out, or what needs to get moved outside to harden off, or like what can you move under the bench to make more room on the top of the bench. If you're working with more than one person, I think it's really nice to have that communication. So I have one person, basically her first priority job is to do things in the greenhouse. I would say this time of year, like spring, she's probably working in here at least 50% of the time, maybe more like 80% of the time. So that's maybe like almost one full-time employee. And then whenever there's large plantings, I'll have 1 or 2 people come help her for a few hours or maybe even a day, but that's pretty rare. She can kind of manage this on her own. And then I like to come in and see how everything's looking. Sometimes I like to do the watering, but she's my backup person. So if I'm busy for the day, I know somebody's in here checking on the water. So all of this, or rather this greenhouse, is funneling out to our farm, which is about 15 acres. Granted, we don't transplant everything on the 15 acres. There's a lot of things that are direct planted. And this greenhouse is definitely not big enough. Like I'd say we could use about triple this space to actually meet all of our needs, not have to put things underneath if we didn't want to, and not have to use like overflow areas that don't have proper heating. But, you know, we've made it work. Obviously, we sort of bootstrap it together until we figure it out. But so this is, I think we built this greenhouse probably 8 years ago. Before that, we had a really tiny greenhouse, and it's definitely like served its purpose, and we're just finding ways to expand, even though we haven't expanded this. But I think our next kind of big financial layout project is going to be a much bigger propagation house. Like I said, maybe like 3 times this big. But this can feed, say, like 10 to 15 acre farm. So that's a lot. Granted, if we had more space, we might put some things in larger sizes. Okay, here we are in our barn. So what we have in here is an old commercial refrigerator that we had sitting in our yard. It's probably pretty easy to do on your own if you're super handy, but we bought a little like mini course through, I think it's called Growing Farmers. I might have that wrong. on how to build your own germination chamber, but the main thing is that you want to buy a controller that's going to control your humidity and temperature. So we can set the temperature to anything we want, and the humidity. It's actually empty right now, which is very rare. We pulled everything out. So we have two crock pots. One controls the humidity, one controls the temperature, which is controlled on that outside panel. And then we seat all of our trays and we stack them as high as possible. We try to put everything in the germination chamber that likes a similar temperature. I have a little log here of what we put in and how many days it takes to help us for future reference. I also have, printed out like from a few different sites, basically different crops, the temperature range that they prefer, optimum temperature, and then how many days it takes to germinate. Because the big deal is to not, like basically as soon as like one little seedling is popping up, you're pulling them out. If they're stuck in there with no light, in one day they'll get too leggy and be almost unusable. So you need to be, as soon as you have stuff in there and you kind of know how many days it should take to germinate, you should be checking it twice a day, probably a day or two before you think it'll pop up, and pulling it out. We also keep a little log on the front here of like what we have in there if there's multiple people managing it. I mean, I've definitely lost a few trays by not pulling them out early enough, but for the most part, if we know stuff's in there, we're in the habit of checking it twice a day and we pull stuff out. It's super, and I can say that having grown for many, many years, this germination chamber has made our success rate on seedlings like jump through the roof. I mean, sometimes you're getting poor seed and that's why you have poor germination, but really giving it its optimum conditions with humidity and temperature is it just gets you so far ahead. It's awesome. Okay, once plants are up to their like optimum size and they're ready to get transplanted either to a greenhouse or out in the ground, we pull them out of this is the greenhouse we were inside earlier, out of our greenhouse, which I forgot to mention we had shade cloth on the top of. We only put that on probably 2 weeks ago. You know, we want as much heat as we can get up to a certain point, and then it starts to be way too hot. So the shade cloth means that like it doesn't overheat as quickly and we don't have to water quite as often with the shade. So that's really helpful. We actually call this the shade house. We haven't installed the shade on this yet. It's all rolled up here, and we'll bring it across here and attach it. So this is our hardening off area. Hardening off is an extremely, extremely important part of the growing cycle. So when everything comes out of the nice, perfect temperature, humidity, lots of water greenhouse, you want to acclimate it to the outdoors before you actually transplant it. So you're basically giving it all the shock it's going to get to the top of the plant, like colder nights, more intense sun. Sorry, we got trucks coming in. More intense sun, wind. You know, we'll give it a little shade to reduce the sun a little bit because we're just so hot and sunny here. There's some equipment coming in. That's a plastic layer. We're getting ready for our early tomatoes / cucumbers in the field. So yeah, this is all plants coming outside. You can see these guys over here. When we brought them out, I think we had one really cold night right after we brought them out. These are cabbage plants, like a second or third generation of cabbage. So they got a little frost nipped. So you can see this outer leaf is a little bit lighter. That's like frost damage, but it's still really green. And it's a cold hardy plant. It's going to completely outgrow that shock. But they don't look beautiful, but it's better that they got the shock now than if we put them in the ground really fresh and tender, and they have their root disturbance and all the field conditions like all on the same day. So you kind of like give them half the torture now and the second half of the torture later. So we've got cabbage, lettuce, a bunch of chicories and radicchio, hard to see from here, kale, all ready to go out. These have been sitting here longer than I like. I like to give them about 3 days to harden off, but these have been out here for 2 weeks already. They're really ready to go. Definitely maxing out their nutrient in their small cells, but a lot of our plants got a lot of torture before they go outside. There's some artichoke plants, but all this is ready to go. Okay, so I just wanted to show you what some of our other greenhouses look like. These are all unheated greenhouses. This is one of the bigger ones, so it's really like an actual greenhouse. A lot of them are more like high tunnels, so they don't have all this truss system and whatnot. But in here we have sweet peas. Everything in these greenhouses grown in the ground. In here we have sweet peas that we started like midwinter and transplanted out here sometime in January. Oh look, January 18th. So we've just started picking these. We have some stuff growing along the edges because there's extra room in the bed as the sweet peas grow up. So we have pansies growing in here. We're just picking them for edible flowers right now. And as they get a little taller, we will use them as cut flowers as well. And some stock growing on the edges here. We're using a lot of the space in here as overflow greenhouse space, even though it's not heated. It stays warm enough at night in here where this stuff won't freeze. These are all tomatoes for plant sales at the farmer's market. We have some trays of peppers just kind of languishing here. Here's an early crop of tomatoes. We can plant tomatoes in this greenhouse about 2 months before we can plant them outside. And we're just bringing the strings down to start trellising them. The strings come down, we clip the tomato to the string as it grows up, and then when it reaches the very top, right there, then we can lower them down and lean them and have them continue to grow without reaching the ceiling. So these will be kind of a long season tomato. This is beefsteak heirlooms and cherries in here. We have some basil planted down the middle. Here we have a lot more. Normally this would be just like a walkway, but we're using it for overflow greenhouse because our greenhouse isn't quite big enough. We have all these peppers and tomatoes in pots to sell. We have some cucumbers here that are long overdue for being planted somewhere in a greenhouse, and they may just end up going outside because we ran out of space. Here's some early eggplant. You can actually see these were planted right around the same time. These are in 72 cell trays, planted on 210, and they're just going to grow to a certain point and then stop. They're plenty good size to plant. And then here's ones planted on 2.8, so 2 days earlier, that actually we have in bigger pots to sell, but like look at how much more beautiful and big that plant is. So I just feel like, you know, everything is a trade-off between space and what you need to grow and how much soil and time you want to put into it. But you can just see the big difference there. So this plant is going to grow quicker and be healthier, but sometimes we grow a lot of things from smaller cells just out of space convenience. They're much faster to plant because it's a smaller size. So the one thing we could have done differently here is planted these later. They would have just gotten to this size and be ready to plant out rather than kind of sitting in their tray, running out of nutrients, turning yellow. So here's a bunch of crops planted in the ground. There's delphinium here, Icelandic poppies, Chantilly snapdragons, foxglove, and this is Scoop scabiosa that hasn't quite started blooming yet. A couple random anemones from last year that came up. Here you can see these are about to bloom. I'll show you. Got a little ways to go before they color up, but these are getting really close. And then campanula down here. It hasn't quite started yet either. So this whole tunnel was kind of planned to bloom for Mother's Day, and it's mostly working. So I just wanted to touch briefly on pests and diseases. So I'm not the best person with diseases. Usually when I do get something, I'm not always sure what it is. And I have to ask a friend, ask my extension agent, or send it off to a lab. Pests are a little bit easier. I kind of know what our main pest issues are. I've been having some aphids on these snapdragons. I've sprayed them with pyrethrin a couple times. I don't know if you can see, there's like a little stickiness going on here that's like residue from the aphids. So we're not certified organic, but we only use organic pest control issues. But with such a big diversity of crops that we grow and so much area and acreage, it's really challenging to stay on top of it. So some things get away from us. I don't tend to have a lot of disease or pests in the actual propagation greenhouse where we grow the seedlings. Sometimes we get fungus gnats. They're those really tiny guys that just sort of, live on the soil surface and then fly around. If you brush your hand over it, they kind of like puff up. But so for that, what I try to do is just reduce the watering. Try not to let the plants wilt too much, but try to let it dry out in between waterings. And if that isn't doing the trick, sometimes I'll go top the trays with like some vermiculite or extra soil mist. Vermiculite's really nice because it's really light and it drains quickly. So a lot of times there'll be like a little bit of algae growth on the surface of the cells in the trays, and then the fungus gnats like to live there. So if you can top it with something that'll be drier, you can kind of eliminate that. I just came over here to show you there seems to be some stuff going on with the poppies. Like they kind of get these slimy brown leaves. So I'm sure that's some disease, and it probably means there's just too much moisture going on here. But if it's something more harmful, I guess I'm not aware. And we seem to be getting enough of a crop off of it anyway. But yeah, we try to monitor the pest situations and do what we can, but oftentimes I think just with our organic controls and how much we have going on, sometimes we just can't get a handle on all of it, and so we kind of make do with what we can. I do have, I'm trying to think what other pests or diseases we have in the greenhouse. The other thing that can happen commonly in the greenhouse is dampening off, which is like I believe a fungus growing in the soil. But you can usually minimize that with controlling the water, like not overwatering. And also the faster you can get your seeds to germinate and grow to like a good size, then they can pretty much not succumb to the dampening off, like they can sort of hold their own. And so that, again, it's like having the right temperatures for your plants where they're having optimal growth and kind of growing up quick and strong. It doesn't matter if there's a little bit of that dampening off in the soil, they can kind of they can kind of do okay on their own. It's when you have those languishing, really slow growing, kind of not doing too well seedlings that a lot of times they just kind of rot from the bottom when you have dampening off. So I can think of on the pest and disease pressure at the moment. We generally don't like sanitize our trays or anything like that, but we do sanitize our germination chamber pretty frequently, just because it's so humid and temperature controlled in there. You can get some mold growth. But other than that, yep, that's all I have right now.